Imagine an empire that dominates the world militarily, economically, and culturally until its debts grow larger than its power. That empire was Rome. And if the collapse of Roman stability sounds disturbingly familiar, it's because we're repeating their endgame with mathematical precision. Rome didn't fall from barbarian invasions or military defeat. It fell because its financial system became a hollow shell, propped up by inflation, tax desperation, and elite denial. Now look around. America, like Rome, funds its global dominance with impossible debt, suppresses dissent with monetary expansion, and clings to illusions of control while its foundations erode. The parallels aren't just academic, they're a warning, and we're ignoring it again. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from the cold rains of Britannia to the golden sands of Arabia, a sprawling colossus that seemed to defy history itself. Emperors issued coins with divine faces and triumphant slogans. Monuments were raised in marble to immortalize victories, and census takers recorded millions under the imperial banner. Trade flourished along the Mediterranean, and the famed Roman roads carried not just legions but grain, silk, gold, and taxes. On the surface, it was a golden age, but that shine was already tarnished by the rust of debt. The costs of governing this vast domain, feeding the legions, maintaining infrastructure, bribing political allies, and buying off potential threats, grew faster than the revenues extracted from provinces. To fill the gaps, emperors leaned increasingly on two tools: forced loans from wealthy elites and the systematic debasement of the currency. Silver content in the denarius, once a symbol of Roman stability, began its steady decline under emperors like Nero and Caracalla, who masked insolvency by minting more coins with less metal. Provincial governors, under pressure to deliver tribute and grain, resorted to brutal extractions that drained local economies and sowed quiet discontent. Meanwhile, Rome funded grandeur not with productive surplus, but with illusions, public spectacles paid for by borrowed coin, bread distributions that hid food insecurity, and new tax schemes that pulled future prosperity into the present. The imperial budget became a ledger of fictions where military triumphs were celebrated with borrowed money and deficits were denied behind layers of bureaucratic fog. Senators praised the emperor's wisdom while quietly fleeing to country villas to avoid the fiscal rot infecting the capital. Rome's might endured not because it was solvent, but because no one dared challenge the illusion. Yet, the true power of Rome became its ability to maintain the appearance of control even as its foundation shifted beneath it. What the emperors refused to see or admit was that Rome had already crossed a line. It was no longer living within its means. It was borrowing time, stealing stability from the future, and using coinage as propaganda to preserve a myth of permanence. The barbarians were not yet at the gates, but the math had already turned against them. The empire's collapse hadn't begun with sword or siege, but with spreadsheets, forged ledgers, and denial. Rome, the eternal city, was living on credit, and the bill, though unseen, was already in the mail. As the empire expanded beyond its logistical limits, the true cost of Roman supremacy revealed itself in legions, not laurels. Every new frontier required roads, forts, supply lines, and thousands of troops stationed year-round, not just to conquer, but to hold. From Dacia to Mesopotamia, the empire bled coin for control. Yet the treasure chests that once overflowed with spoils of conquest began to arrive emptier with each campaign, and the provinces that had been rich targets became fiscal burdens. In response, emperors turned to the mint. The silver denarius, once nearly pure, became a shell of its former self. Its core increasingly copper, its value maintained only by imperial decree and public habit. What had started as a temporary measure under Nero became policy under later emperors like Septimius Severus and Gallienus. Soldiers, the backbone of imperial power, noticed the deception first. Their pay, still calculated in nominal coin, no longer bought the same bread, wine, or land it once had. Discontent grew in the ranks, and emperors were forced to raise wages, not in real terms, but in quantity. More debased coins flooded the economy to satisfy military demands, triggering even higher prices across the empire. A loaf of bread that once cost a single denarius might require 10, then 20, each worth less than the last. In cities, merchants raised prices daily, unable to keep up with the shrinking value of imperial money. Farmers refused to sell grain at fixed prices, knowing tomorrow's currency would be weaker still. This spiral, where monetary manipulation funded soldiers who in turn demanded more money due to inflation caused by that same manipulation, became Rome's inescapable loop. Emperors who refused to raise military pay risked mutiny. Those who did deepened the crisis. The army, once a tool of conquest, had become the empire's largest creditor, holding the sword in one hand and a pay scroll in the other. With each new minting, the empire mortgaged its future to maintain loyalty today. And yet, every fiscal emergency became another excuse for coinage debasement. By the 3rd century, the denarius was a ghost, its silver content below 5%, its trust eroded, its authority mocked even in the markets of Rome itself. Entire provinces stopped accepting imperial coin, reverting instead to local barter systems or foreign currency. But the legions still marched, and they still demanded pay. And so the presses ran day and night, printing money not backed by metal, nor trust, nor productivity, but by fear, denial, and necessity. Rome, once rich in spoils, now sustained itself through monetary decay. Each campaign required coinage to finance it. Each coinage required debasement. Each debasement required denial. And each denial pushed the empire one step further into the abyss it could no longer afford to recognize. With the currency debased and inflation galloping beyond control, the Roman state turned desperately toward its only remaining asset, its people. Taxation became the primary engine of imperial finance, not to build aqueducts or fund civic life, but to plug the gaping holes left by decades of fiscal rot. Provincial governors, no longer satisfied with predictable levies, began imposing arbitrary quotas based on theoretical yields rather than actual production. A smallholder in North Africa or Gaul might be taxed on the assumption of a bumper harvest even after a drought had destroyed his crops. Those unable to meet these demands had their land seized or were imprisoned, further destroying their ability to contribute. Cities that had once thrived on commerce and civic pride found themselves crushed under new obligations. Fiscus payments, forced grain contributions, and demands for labor corvée. Urban professionals, craftsmen, and merchants faced invasive audits and coerced loans to support the state. The once proud middle class, those who held modest estates, ran local shops, or administered civic functions, began to vanish. Many fled their ancestral lands, abandoning homes that had been in their families for generations to escape impossible burdens. Whole regions of the empire began to empty out. In places like Hispania and the Balkans, farmland lay fallow, villas collapsed into ruin, and marketplaces fell silent. Those who stayed behind often slipped into subsistence, no longer engaging in taxable trade, surviving by barter, or retreating into extended households that pooled resources and avoided detection. The collapse was not sudden, but it was relentless. Census records shrank as the state lost track of its population. In a perverse twist, this data loss only encouraged more aggressive taxation against those still visible, accelerating the very decline it sought to reverse. The more the state squeezed, the less it received, and the less it received, the harder it squeezed. In the cities, administrative posts once seen as prestigious became traps. Curialis, local officials responsible for tax collection, found themselves personally liable for unpaid balances. Many went bankrupt or fled their posts, knowing they would be ruined by the very system they served. The imperial bureaucracy, increasingly blind and desperate, responded not with reform, but with compulsion, issuing edicts that made tax obligations hereditary. If a father was a baker, a tax collector, or a tenant farmer, so too must be the son. Choice vanished, and with it, the social mobility that had once characterized Rome's middle class. The Roman dream of hard work rewarded with land, legacy, and legal protection died in the shadows of its own tax system. In its place rose a feudal rigidity born not of tradition, but of crisis. Ghost towns dotted the landscape, silent reminders of what had been lost. A society built on participation reduced to one of evasion, suspicion, and quiet despair. The imperial state had tried to preserve itself by draining its citizens. Instead, it had killed the very class that once made the empire prosper. As Rome's economic fabric unraveled, the empire's response shifted from desperation to control. Financial repression became official policy, not through currency or taxation alone, but through the systematic removal of personal freedom. What began as fiscal policy evolved into a legal architecture of entrapment. Citizens could no longer move to escape hardship, nor could they shift professions to seek opportunity. The laws of Diocletian and later Constantine institutionalized this immobility. Farmers were bound to their soil, classified as colony, effectively serfs, tethered to the estates on which they were born. Their children inherited not just their land, but their legal status. Bakers in Antioch or Constantinople were forced by decree to continue baking bread regardless of profit or loss. They could not shut their ovens or leave the city without imperial permission. Sons of soldiers were conscripted from birth, inheriting military service as a caste rather than a choice. Professions that once conferred dignity became cages, and guilds that had offered protection evolved into enforcement arms of the state. The empire no longer viewed citizens as participants in a republic or subjects of a benevolent emperor, but as components in a machine that could not be allowed to break or change shape. The tax rolls became chains. Escape attempts were met with brutal penalties, property confiscation, public whipping, even forced labor in state workshops. Entire families were punished for the flight of one member. Informant networks blossomed as neighbors betrayed one another to avoid suspicion. To maintain appearances of productivity, imperial auditors would visit villages long since emptied by flight, demanding taxes from officials who hadn't seen the supposed taxpayers in years. Instead of acknowledging the depopulation, the state simply shifted the burden onto those who remained. Administrative inertia fed delusion. As long as someone could be forced to carry the burden, Rome could pretend the system still functioned. But those who lived within it knew the truth. The empire was no longer a civilization of law and citizenship. It had become a containment zone. What the emperors called reform was in fact a slow enslavement of the freeborn. The geography of Rome narrowed. Citizens couldn't leave their town, their farm, or their trade, and yet the rhetoric of unity, glory, and divine order continued unabated. Edicts referenced the greatness of Rome even as the people shackled by them bartered for bread in alleys, unable to leave, or even breathe without permission. Beneath the soaring arches and imperial insignias, a grim reality hardened. The empire could no longer afford to let people leave. Freedom, in all its forms, had become an economic liability. And so, to preserve the fiction of solvency, Rome chose to eliminate mobility, locking its citizens inside a system whose decline they could no longer escape. By the mid-3rd century, the once mighty Roman monetary system had collapsed into irrelevance, its coins so adulterated that even borderland tribes refused to accept them. What began as subtle debasement had become overt fraud. Silver coins that gleamed falsely, copper beneath their thin plating, symbols of an imperial promise no longer believed. Markets that once bustled with trade in every province of the empire, from Alexandria's docks to the spice stalls of Antioch, fell silent as currency lost its function. Merchants refused to accept coins that lost value week to week, and so barter re-emerged, not as novelty but as necessity. A blacksmith might trade iron tools for wheat, a teacher might be paid in salted meat. In Gaul, entire communities reverted to subsistence systems where taxes were collected in sheaves of barley or flocks of chickens, stored in granaries instead of treasuries. Salaries for soldiers, once counted in denarii, now arrived in oil, grain, and cloth, distributed in crumbling storehouses instead of imperial pay chests. The empire, unable to provide hard currency of value, leaned into this fragmentation, institutionalizing payments in kind as if the regression were a planned reform. But the loss of monetary cohesion shattered more than markets. It dissolved the connective tissue of Roman administration. Uniform pricing gave way to local valuations. A bushel of wheat in Illyria might be worth twice as much as the same grain in Sicily, but there was no currency to compare them. Trade routes shriveled as merchants could no longer reconcile exchange. Tax assessors, once equipped with standardized ledgers, now had to calculate complex equivalents in livestock and produce, often resorting to coercion rather than measurement. Corruption exploded, governors accepted bribes in cattle, and local officials stockpiled grain not for famine but for profit. The imperial bureaucracy, designed to function atop a cash economy, began to seize instead of serve. Rome's famed uniformity, its ability to rule diverse peoples with a common system, eroded into a mosaic of isolated zones, each with its own barter norms and economic rituals. The empire had once prided itself on standardization: roads, laws, coins, citizenship. Now, its internal provinces resembled a patchwork of medieval fiefs, centuries before feudalism had a name. Even among Rome's allies and satellite states, the rejection of Roman currency became a silent rebellion, a refusal to accept the authority of a government that could no longer back its promises. And in this silence, something deeper was lost. A coin is not just metal, it is a symbol of shared trust. When Rome's coins lost their meaning, so too did the belief that the empire could enforce order, justice, or unity. In its place rose survival economies, resilient, yes, but fragmented, fragile, and devoid of imperial loyalty. The world had not collapsed in fire, but in copper dust and broken trade. The empire was still standing, but its money was dead. And in the ruins of its currency lay the bones of its coherence. With its monetary system shattered and its population either fleeing, hiding, or bartering on the fringes, Rome resorted to the last tool left to an empire in decline: force. What the state could no longer inspire through legitimacy, it would now extract through fear. The once civil functionaries of the imperial bureaucracy, who had served as the connective sinews between capital and province, were replaced or reinforced by men with swords. Tax collectors no longer traveled alone with ledgers. They arrived flanked by soldiers bearing decrees and chains. Local officials were given arrest powers. If quotas weren't met, property was seized on the spot: tools, oxen, harvests, even the land itself. Entire family lines were declared liable for a single man's tax debt. A widow might lose her home because her deceased husband had owed a few bushels of grain the year before. Meanwhile, military recruitment took on the character of a hunt. Voluntary enlistment, once the pride of Roman virtue, evaporated as life in the legions meant brutal service on distant frontiers with diminishing pay. Conscription teams scoured villages, dragging able-bodied men from their fields, often leaving families defenseless and farms to ruin. Resistance was met with exemplary punishment. In Gaul, whole districts were punished for harboring deserters. In the East, conscription quotas were filled by taking boys as young as 13. This shift from citizen participation to state compulsion marked a fatal transformation. The empire no longer viewed its people as citizens, partners in a civil project, but as state-owned assets whose labor, loyalty, and even lives could be requisitioned at will. Bureaucratic roles became hereditary not by law alone, but by enforcement. If a father was a tax collector, his son could not escape the role, even if it meant being hated by neighbors or marked for assassination. Entire professions became despised arms of the state. Imperial edicts, once issued to foster order, now read like threats. Failure to meet grain requisitions was treason. Harboring the tax dodger was sedition. Surveillance expanded, informants were rewarded. The social trust that had once sustained Roman civic life disintegrated into a landscape of suspicion and silence. In the cities, crowds learned to scatter at the approach of imperial inspectors. In the countryside, farmers buried what little surplus they had to avoid detection. The state responded by employing torture to extract confessions of hidden wealth. With each act of coercion, the empire widened the chasm between itself and the very people it claimed to protect. The imperial eagle still flew above courtrooms and fortresses, but beneath its wings, the population had become prey, not partners. Rome had not merely become authoritarian, it had become predatory. The bureaucracy that once unified a continent through law and engineering now devoured its own population to keep the imperial machine creaking forward. Every tax demanded at sword point, every boy stolen for the legion, every field left untended after forced conscription marked another fracture in the fragile shell of empire. The people had stopped believing, and the empire, in turn, had stopped pretending to care. As Rome tightened its grip on the struggling masses, a different reality unfolded behind the marble columns of senatorial estates and palatial villas. The elites, who once prided themselves on civic duty and Roman virtue, had evolved into a class apart, legally, financially, and morally divorced from the suffering that defined the rest of the empire. While farmers were beaten for failing to meet grain quotas, senators arranged tax exemptions through favors and bribes. Imperial laws designed to ensure equitable contribution were riddled with loopholes accessible only to those with influence. Wealthy landowners shifted their holdings into private trusts, reclassifying taxable estates as sacred temple lands or merging them into imperial foundations protected by law. Gold was hidden in foreign accounts or buried in estates staffed by private militias. Governors, themselves drawn from the elite, looked the other way in exchange for patronage or future favors. The result was grotesque. The greater the crisis, the lighter the burden for those best able to pay. In cities like Carthage and Antioch, senatorial families continued to host lavish banquets, while a mile outside the walls, food riots broke out in collapsing marketplaces. Elites secured military protection not for the public good but for their private convoys, ensuring their estates remained untouched even as frontier towns were abandoned to invading tribes. They spoke of patriotism while financing private tolls and raising local taxes to fund personal security. And as the state descended into coercion, it found the path of least resistance was downward. Unable or unwilling to confront elite evasion, imperial administrators leaned harder on those without the means to flee, bribe, or bargain. Mid-level farmers were squeezed until their lands were confiscated. Urban professionals were assessed according to outdated registers, forced to pay taxes based on long-gone wealth. Artisans disappeared, swallowed into debt bondage. The state, in preserving the privileges of the few, guaranteed the ruin of the many. Civil service, once a ladder of upward mobility, became a sentence. Posts were passed down not as inheritance but as punishment, positions. So toxic they came with no salary, only liability. Local councils, once vibrant engines of municipal governance, collapsed as families abandoned their ancestral towns to escape endless obligations. And all the while, the elite remained insulated behind legal immunities and private networks of power. They lobbied emperors, funded temples, and performed public benefactions to maintain appearances, but they no longer participated in the Roman project. They watched from gilded balconies as the streets below fell into disorder, their wealth untouchable, their loyalty conditional, and their hands clean, at least in the ledgers of the law. But in the eyes of a collapsing empire, the truth was plain. The rot at the bottom was made possible by betrayal at the top. Rome was not just collapsing under foreign pressure or economic strain. It was collapsing from abandonment. The people had been left to drown while the captains of the ship built lifeboats only for themselves. And when the water finally reached the deck, there was no one left rowing. By the 4th century, the once unifying force of Roman administration had fractured into a patchwork of semi-autonomous zones, each governed more by necessity than law, more by personal allegiance than imperial command. As the central government's grip weakened, provincial governors, military generals, and wealthy landowners stepped into the vacuum, not as loyal stewards of Rome, but as sovereigns in all but name. These local powers collected taxes, raised militias, and administered justice without waiting for authorization from the capital. Imperial edicts still circulated, sealed in purple and adorned with the imperial eagle, but outside the shrinking circle of imperial influence, they were little more than ceremonial paper. In Hispania, tax collectors now answered to regional warlords who enforced their own tariffs and tolls. In North Africa, grain shipments once destined for Rome were rerouted to local garrisons or foreign traders, bartered through networks that bypassed the empire entirely. Even in Italy itself, large estates functioned as fortified enclaves, ruled by landlords who negotiated directly with marauding bands or rival commanders, maintaining peace not through loyalty to the emperor but through strategic bribery and private defense. Rome's once absolute currency lost its meaning as communities reverted to barter or adopted foreign coinage. Eastern provinces increasingly preferred Byzantine solidi or Sassanid drachmas, while in the West, local tokens and weights replaced any imperial standard. The very idea of a Roman economy became an abstraction, as markets fragmented into localized systems that valued practical exchange over imperial decree. Military commanders, starved of funding and support from Rome, took matters into their own hands, Some declared loyalty to pretender emperors. Others dispensed with pretense and ruled as kings in all but title. The Rhine frontier, once lined with disciplined legions, became a constellation of power centers led by generals who taxed the local population for their upkeep and negotiated directly with invading tribes. When word came from Rome to raise additional troops or remit revenue, replies arrived late, or not at all. Communication between the provinces and the capital slowed to a trickle, not from logistical failure, but from deliberate neglect. Rome's central bureaucracy, bloated and underfunded, could no longer enforce compliance. And even when it attempted to assert control, it found itself unable to project power beyond the roads it still controlled, many of which were crumbling from neglect. The empire had not officially split, but its cohesion had disintegrated. From Gaul to Syria, the question was no longer what Rome ordered, but whether Rome mattered. In some cases, imperial officials themselves cut deals with regional powers to preserve their positions, creating a new form of legitimacy that rested on proximity, not imperial sanction. Rome's authority, once sacred, became symbolic. Its coinage was mocked, its decrees were ignored. Its borders, once patrolled with precision, became permeable suggestions. And at the heart of it all, the capital stood increasingly irrelevant, grand in memory, hollow in power, a faded beacon in a world that no longer looked to it for light. As Rome slipped deeper into systemic failure, its officials clung tighter to the symbols of unity, declaring victories where there were none, publishing reforms that never reached implementation, and maintaining a narrative of imperial strength even as the structure beneath them crumbled. Emperors issued currency revaluations as if they were solutions, not symptoms. Speeches in the Senate celebrated military triumphs over enemies who had never been defeated or never even fought. Statues were erected in honor of public benefactors who had bankrupted cities. This was not merely propaganda, it was denial masquerading as policy. Reality had become too dangerous to confront, so it was reimagined instead. The empire painted over decay with ceremony and titles, pretending continuity as the ground gave way beneath its citizens. Today, America walks that same path, not in togas and triumphal arches, but in balance sheets and digital dashboards. The dollar, once anchored by gold and backed by industrial might, now floats on promises and debt. Just as Rome debased the denarius until it became a hollow symbol, modern monetary policy floods the system with liquidity while pretending this does not erode purchasing power. Inflation is rebranded as transitory, deficits as stimulus, and unsustainable debt as investment in the future. When citizens question this logic, the system responds not with answers but with barriers. Try withdrawing your 401k before age 59 and a half. Try moving your capital offshore. Try questioning the official narrative of economic strength, and you'll find yourself labeled a doomsayer, a threat to stability. Compliance is not requested, it is engineered. The tax code, bloated and obscure, functions not just as revenue collection, but as behavior enforcement. The financial system, dense with penalties, processing delays, and reporting requirements, makes it harder to leave than to stay. And like Rome, America's elite are exempt. While ordinary citizens face inflation, surveillance, and audit risk, the wealthy restructure assets through shell entities, lobby for favorable legislation, and fund institutions that reaffirm their worldview. Denial is institutionalized. Official projections assume infinite growth, ignoring the mathematical ceiling imposed by demographics, productivity, and debt service. Political leaders speak of prosperity even as homelessness rises, infrastructure decays, and civic trust disintegrates. As in Rome, continuity is preserved through theater, not function. The debt ceiling is raised reflexively, markets are pacified with Fed assurances, and every economic shock is met with a liquidity injection, not structural reform. But the symptoms are visible: collapsing birth rates, polarized politics, regional instability, and a population increasingly skeptical of the institutions that claim to serve it. What America calls progress bears eerie resemblance to the Roman descent: control without trust, policy without outcome, power without accountability. And just as Rome punished attempts to flee its collapsing system, so too does modern finance trap wealth inside digital gates, legal penalties, and economic dependencies. The architecture of denial remains unchanged. Rome refused to admit it was falling until it had already fallen. America, armed with history, algorithms, and central banks, believes it is immune. But history does not care about belief. It only cares about math, and the math is beginning to rhyme. The fall of Rome was not a singular event marked by fire and invasion, but a slow, grinding erosion, driven by contradictions too vast to reconcile and numbers too stark to ignore. The empire's promises of safety, prosperity, and order had outgrown its ability to deliver them. Roads once maintained by tax revenues turned to rubble. Armies once loyal to the Senate followed local warlords. Civic buildings stood hollow while their marble was stripped to patch city walls. Beneath every decree and census, the empire ran on broken arithmetic. More soldiers than rations, more expenses than revenues, more coinage than silver. And at the heart of that entropy was a simple, brutal truth. The system could no longer sustain the obligations it had incurred. Every new law, tax, or edict was a delay tactic, a denial of the unpayable bill. The collapse came not with Rome's sack, but in the generations that preceded it, when belief in its solvency and moral authority vanished. People stopped trusting the currency, stopped attending civic functions, stopped participating in the very machinery that had once bound them to empire. And in that silence, the structure gave way. Today, America faces its own form of this unraveling, not with spears or centurions, but with spreadsheets, debt ceilings, and liquidity injections that defy fiscal gravity. The dollar, like the denarius, is treated as an instrument of confidence rather than intrinsic value, inflated beyond comprehension to sustain commitments that no longer match the underlying economy. National debt surges past $33 trillion. Interest payments eclipse defense budgets, and yet new entitlements are promised by the day. Politicians speak of infinite stimulus, infinite growth, infinite leverage, mathematical delusions that would be familiar to any Roman bureaucrat counting ghost taxpayers and unrealized grain. Meanwhile, infrastructure cracks, trust in institutions collapses, and citizens turn inward or flee into digital and ideological enclaves. The public realm, like the Roman Forum in its final years, becomes a stage of appearances where consensus is feigned and accountability is absent. The ruling class, insulated by wealth and complexity, offers reassurances without correction, managing decline through narrative and suppression rather than reform. But mathematics does not negotiate. It accumulates, calculates, and settles. And the American system, like Rome's, now operates on a ledger of impossible equations. Deficits that can't be reversed, growth that can't be replicated, inflation targets that can't be met without suppressing truth. The warning signs echo across centuries: currency devaluation, overextended militaries, rising internal surveillance, widening wealth gaps, and political theater in place of governance. These are not symptoms of decline. They are the formula of collapse. What Rome endured through the slow decay of silver, America risks through digital denial, algorithmic stability, and the hubris that power can outrun arithmetic. In the end, empires do not die in battle. They expire in disbelief. When the numbers no longer add up and the people no longer care, the fall is not an event. It is a reckoning. And America, like Rome, is running out of time to solve equations it still refuses to admit exist.